Hi there, I'm Lizzie Parker from the Farm Carbon Toolkit. I'm our calculator manager here at FCT, and I'm going to give you the presentation that I'll be giving at the PGRO Roadshows in January. So I'll just share my screen. Everybody can see that. So I'll be looking over here. So we're from the Farm Carbon Toolkit. We're a community interest company that was set up around 12 years ago by farmers, and our work is always for farmers. So our board is still all farmers. Many of our staff are also farming, and kind of our mission is to be able to support farmers to understand carbon footprinting and carbon accounting, and to be able to use it as a tool to allow them to continue to produce quality food in the UK, as well as building profitable and resilient enterprises that also help the UK to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. So what this practically means is we have a team of 7 advisors who are out on farm all day, every day, pretty much, supporting farmers to do their carbon footprint and to understand what it means, and to turn that into action plans and roadmaps for their business, so that they can continue to farm sustainably. We also offer a large range of tools online for free in our toolkit, and we also offer a carbon calculator that farmers can use for free, and that supply chains and agronomists and consultants can use as professionals if they take out a license with us, and so that they can support farmers as well. We provide lots of training for that. We also undertake farm trials as parts of other projects. We work a lot on creating communities of farmers who can learn from each other, and particularly in the southwest, we have the Farm Net Zero project, which was the first lottery funded project to fund farmers as a community. So we facilitate that project, which helps farmers to learn from each other, basically. So today we're going to talk about carbon footprinting. You might never have thought of carbon footprinting your farm, or you might know that it's something you need to do. You might be well on the way, and there's lots of tools out there available to do this with. But before we get into it, probably the most important thing is to just address some of the jargon that goes alongside it. So I'm going to be talking about carbon dioxide a lot, and I'm going to probably talk in terms of carbon. When we say that, we're actually normally talking about lots of different greenhouse gases, but the way in carbon accounting we equate them all is to use a metric called tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And what this broadly means is that however much that gas might contribute to global warming, we can convert that into tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, so that we can compare them all and combine them all within the same metric. We'll talk quite a lot about carbon balance, which is this idea that all businesses, or farms particularly, will be emitting greenhouse gases, but they may also be removing some greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. Today we're going to focus on emissions, because it's the first thing that you need to be able to evidence, but we can touch on removals a little bit later on if we want to. But understanding that there's that kind of emissions and removals is important in understanding when people are talking about targets, because typically targets are set as targets towards net zero, and net zero is when those removals equal those emissions in terms of tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. You'll also hear a lot about different scopes, and broadly you're talking about direct emissions and indirect emissions. So scope 1 are your direct emissions that might come directly from things that you do on farm, so all the fuels that you burn to run your machinery, anything you do that directly releases greenhouse gases from the land, like ploughing or incorporating residues, storing manure, applying fertilizers, and they release lots of nitrous oxide, which is a greenhouse gas. Your scope 2s, broadly, we're talking about electricity generation. So you're directly responsible for how much gets used, but you haven't produced the electricity yourself typically. Indirect is where people get a bit tied up. So if everyone were reporting their scope, if every business was reporting their scope 1s and 2s, we wouldn't need to collect information on scope 3, but the reality is that just hasn't been the case to date and would be very tricky for everyone to report all their scope 1 and 2 emissions. So what happens in carbon accounting is that we also report scope 3s, and this includes embedded emissions, so emissions that were produced by someone else but that were involved in producing products that you buy. So producing a fertilizer or a pesticide takes a lot of energy. That's a scope 3 emission, but applying the fertilizer onto your land causes further emissions, and that's a scope 1 emission. So you can see it gets a little bit complicated, and that's where some of the tools come in and helping you. So when I'm talking about the different gases and where they're coming from, there's, we can talk about carbon dioxide, but if we think about carbon dioxide as a t-shirt that keeps the atmosphere warmer than it would otherwise be, we can think of methane as being a woolly jumper. So methane has more global warming potential than carbon dioxide. And nitrous oxide is like the thickest ski jacket you could put on. And we can see this if we look at the values. So for every 1 ton of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, for every 1 ton of nitrous oxide in the atmosphere, that is equivalent to 265 tons of carbon dioxide being in the atmosphere. And you can see that the proportion of the nitrous oxide in the atmosphere that is attributable to agriculture in the UK is 70%. So it's a lot of our UK nitrous oxide is produced because of agriculture, and that's why there's a shifting focus onto farms being able to reduce those emissions. And so one reason why we might want to do a carbon footprint as a farm is because we're getting pressure. we're being asked to report it. Farms are businesses just like any other, and there is this kind of deadline that all businesses will have to produce a carbon footprint, at least for their scope 1 and 2 emissions. But we see it, carbon footprinting, slightly differently, and that was the whole reason that Farm Carbon Toolkit was set up, was that actually looking at your business in terms of carbon is like looking at it through a different lens. So it's not an economic lens, it's looking at it through a carbon lens. And any process that takes you through accounting for something all the way to your business is gonna make you less wasteful. It's gonna help you highlight hotspots that you need to address, or inefficiencies that you hadn't noticed. And so it really is a process that can lead to better business resilience, better understanding of your own system, and can give you ideas of ways to do things differently. Increasingly, there's pressure from supply chains and consumers to be able to differentiate products based on how they've been produced, and a carbon footprint is one way to do that, to show that you're taking that initiative to improve the environmental footprint of your products. And increasingly, people want to understand their emissions so that they can start to understand their removals and get involved in these kind of nature-based solutions, voluntary offsetting, carbon markets, etc. But what we would say, our message would be that you can't start to understand your removals until you've got a really good handle on your emissions, because the first thing that you should be asked in any kind of ethical carbon market is, well, how much is this beyond the emissions that you've produced? So it has to be your carbon balance, not just removals on their own. So it still sounds like lots of potentially big new words and things. It's not as scary as it sounds. We've tried to make it easy for people. So what you need to do is go and have a look either at our calculator or somebody else's, but obviously I'm going to show you ours. I'll do a little demo here. So when you arrive at the calculator, you will arrive at a page like this. You create a free account with very few details, just a username and login. A username and password. You log in and you will see this page, it gives you lots of FAQs. So if you're feeling a bit lost, there's video guides and lots of questions. How do I use this? What do I do with it? Why is this different for livestock, etc. But really simply, you want to start the calculator. All you have to do is tell it the report name and make sure the dates are set. So we've currently got the dates up to today, but probably we would want to do a calendar year, for example, 1st of the 1st 23 to 31st of the 12th 23, for example. You can do it on a cropping year, or you can do it on a calendar year or a financial year, just as long as you're consistent year on year. You have options to fill in these things. So you would choose for standard, but I'm going to choose testing today. You might be an arable business only, you might be mixed, you might be an upland grazing, whatever it is, you can pop those in. It's not essential. And you also want to have a little think about whether you're just wanting to include your farm business, whether you have distribution onwards included in your farm business, or whether you go right to the point of sale. So for example, if you were a veg box scheme, you might choose all of these. If you're just farming and somebody else is responsible for the distribution of from your farm onwards, you can just leave it at that. You can add notes, you can keep details safe about any of these other things, but it's not essential. But you do want to put in the area of your farm. So how much is cultivated under crops, how much is under grass and grazing, including silage or hay that is kept on farm, and how much is non-cropping. So for example, yards, barns, roadwork, anything like that. So then you're in, you've started your first report. From this point onwards, it will be saved. You don't have to actively save it anywhere. Once you go back to your dashboard, it will appear. So this is our test. We can go back into it and edit it by clicking edit data. You can go back and edit any of the farm details really easily by clicking that edit farm details button. But very simply, we want to start adding information. So one piece of information that nearly everybody always has is red diesel. So nearly everyone has used some red diesel. So all you have to do is very simply click through the drop downs to find what you want. Pop in, maybe this is what I use for combining, for example, if you know. Otherwise, you can just use your total diesel usage. And maybe I used 200 litres. You add it, and it straight away will show you the emissions in tons of CO2e from using that quantity of red diesel. If we add another emission, you'll see straight away, so maybe we used some petrol as well. I'm going to give it a description for now, and maybe we only use 30 litres of petrol. These are low numbers, but you can see that that's a much lower proportion, but you're starting to build up a picture of what has contributed more in your business. So we have all these different categories that you can go through. If this is all you used in terms of fuels, for example, you might have some electricity. Let's pop some electricity in, and we're on an average tariff, let's say. Start to create that picture, but that might be everything you used in a year. You can click this mark complete and go through each of the tabs, can go through in any order that you like and do the same thing. So materials, this might be like building materials, fencing, anything you used that year for repairs and ongoing maintenance. Inventory is things that like buildings, agricultural machinery, shed, etc., that are built once and then are with you on longer term. Crops, here we can add a whole heap of different crops. So this is then accounting for that nitrous oxide from the cultivation of those crops. You can see that we have both agricultural crops. Let's put in field beans and dry peas here. Let's say we harvest 100 tons, 20 acres. And this will be associated with a small emission because of the residues that are left in the field and the roots that are left to rot back in. But what you might also have are some inputs associated with that. So you might have added some nitrogen fertilizer, for example. I'm not sure what the rate would be, but I'm going to put in 20 tons. And over your whole system, you'll start to build up a footprint. And you'll see on the left here, we've got another donut chart which shows us what's coming from fuels, what's coming from crops, and what's coming from those inputs, from those fertilizers. So you work your way through. There's a livestock tab if you have livestock. Waste, how have you disposed of your waste? Did you need to include distribution and processing? And we do have a sequestration tab that talks about removals, but we're not going to talk about that today. If you want to talk about it afterwards, come see me. Or contact me on because this is recorded. Contact me on the email that I'll share at the end. And at any point, you can view the results. So how does this look across your whole farm? We wouldn't recommend sharing it with anyone until you've looked through all those sections and included everything across your whole farm. And you can see here that we'll get a figure that shows your total emissions for your business for that year. Your total removals here, so we haven't entered any yet, and then what that means in terms of your carbon balance. So that, again, just as a reminder, is your emissions minus your offset. You get a heap of KPIs, and these KPIs will vary depending on what type of information you've entered. So if you enter livestock, you'll get some livestock KPIs. If you enter wine growing, there's all sorts of things, and they'll be varied depending on that. If you've used water, you'll get a water KPI, for example. But these are kind of our standard ones, where you'll have your balance per hectare, balance per tonne, and fuel per hectare, as well as fertilizer emissions. And these allow you to start building up a picture year on year of how things are changing. So even if you acquire more land or sell land, or are contract farming and have like a different total land area, you'll still be able to make a comparison year on year because you'll have this per hectare metric. You can also look in more detail at where your hotspots are. So we can see in this example that I've made, inputs are the big ones. Yes, it might reduce our footprint to reduce our fuel emissions, but we want to significantly reduce our emissions, we need to focus on inputs. And then you can go into more detail, again, as we talked about in the intro, like we can break things down by scope and by which greenhouse gases we're emitting. And then we can also look at how we compare against other data within our system. So if we are an arable enterprise, we might only want to look at our emissions per hectare, but we might want to look at it in terms of farm type. So we can tell it that we only want, for example, general cropping to compare against. And you see now we're only comparing ourselves against other general cropping farms, and we're doing better than most. Whereas when we were compared to everyone, we were kind of okay, but it wasn't as obvious how we were doing. So it also might be that you want to compare against others in your own region and see how that affects things. You can choose from different KPIs here, so you can really explore how you're doing compared to other people. You can also see all of your results broken down in lots of detail. You can export your, you can download a PDF with all of these graphs on, or you can download a CSV file or a JSON file which contains all your data. You can go back into your report. It's really easy to use. If you're finished with this report and you want to pass it on to someone, you can choose to lock it, which means you won't be able to edit it anymore, but you will be able to copy it if you want to use it again. You can also start to create scenarios. So we can say, I want to take a first step. I want to make a plan for next year. The first thing I might want to do would be to create a scenario where actually I reduce that diesel usage. So I'd go and I'm going to say I'm going to reduce my diesel usage by 10% by this time next year. So I'd move these dates ahead to 2024 and click save. I could then compare my scenarios against each other. So you see it's not made a really big difference to my overall footprint, because I wasn't using that much anyway, but you can see that it has brought it down a tiny bit. So for us, there might be better ways. You can see fuel per hectare has gone down ever so slightly, but it's not made a big dent. There might be other things, particularly to do with inputs, that we could be doing. Okay, so I'm going to stop demoing now and go back to our presentation. Sorry, there we go. We take questions by email, so please do let me know if you want any support with the calculator. But to bring it back round to pulses and the NCS project that we're involved in, so the Nitrogen Climate Smart that Tom from Boffin is going to talk about as well. We are involved in that project so that we can collate information on how growing beans and peas in rotation is affecting people's carbon footprint, and also how feeding beans and peas, whether whole crop or dried, within livestock rations will affect the carbon footprint of those farms that are doing those various practices. So there's this project called Pulse PEP, which is where farmers are going to do their carbon footprints, try out growing beans and peas, and then do their footprints again, as well as a load of other metrics. And one of the reasons we think this is important is because we see grain legumes as having a lot of potential to reduce carbon footprints, but we want to see if that's true, if that works in practice. So we can see that it is likely to reduce by subbing in grain legumes into livestock feed rations. We can see that reducing the feed emissions, particularly where we're replacing soya products, but also it can lead to improvements in livestock KPIs, particularly where we're considering whole crop protein versus compound feed protein. We can also anticipate that legumes are likely to benefit soil health when they're included in arable rotations for a number of reasons. Everything from we need fewer artificial fertilizers for legume crops, which we know can have a detrimental impact on soil microorganisms and particularly on fungi, but also because they have a different structured root system, which introduces more diversity into the rotation. So we don't know yet whether this is going to be true, whether it's going to be practical. That's the point of the NCS project, is to find out. But one of the kind of drivers, but from our point of view in terms of carbon, is that we know by subbing out some of those synthetic fertilizers, we can reduce the carbon footprint of that farm and of those products. So if we have a rotation that typically is growing cereals, we know the nitrogen requirement, the synthetic nitrogen requirement of peas and beans is lower, and you can see here it's 190 kilos compared to 220. We know that a lot of people get away without any nitrogen on their pea and bean crops, and PGRO will be a much better placed to tell you more about that. But if we take this as a kind of back of an envelope calculation, we know that this reduction is equivalent to reducing the carbon footprint of that field for that year by 0.21 tonnes of carbon per hectare. So you can see that already at a farm scale over 100 hectares, that's a 21 tonne reduction in carbon. What we don't know yet is whether there's higher nitrogen requirements for other years, or how that fits in with the whole picture. So we need to be able to take it from this back of an envelope calculation through to what's actually being changed when people switch their management around, so that we can develop those scenarios for people. The second place we think it's going to have a big effect on farm carbon footprints is in, like I mentioned, swapping out of soya meal. So soya meal has a huge footprint, partly because it often is linked with land use change in places like Brazil and South America. What it is, though, is very cheap, and so it's about finding practical ways to swap out that soya meal for more sustainable options without impacting on nutritional quality and the economics of the situation. So that's why it's really important in the NCS project that there's nutritionists involved, there's experts all the way along the chain, both from the animal health perspective, but also from the agronomy perspective. So just as a kind of example, if we take 100 tons of soya meal as part of the dairy ration, and we swap 20 tons of that out to oilseed rape, which is what a lot of people have been doing recently, that significantly drops the carbon footprint of that total ration. You can see here from 355 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent down to 294 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And so we think there's potential to swap out the OSR to peas. This would have a number of benefits in that the OSR is becoming increasingly difficult to grow because of the pest burden. We might be more likely to grow peas and beans without that pest burden or without that necessity for pesticide. And I think you'll see in some of the other PGRO talks that there's some solutions that seem fairly encouraging for that. But you'll see that it's not a lot lower than the OSR, but it's even lower. And so that's one thing we want to explore. Does that translate into real carbon savings, and is it economically viable for farmers through the NCS project and through the post-PEP carbon footprinting project? So then the third example is looking at including whole crop peas and beans to replace some of the silage in a dairy total ration. So by including whole crop peas and beans in that, instead of some of that silage, you're able to boost the protein content of that fresh feed, which can, in some cases, allow you to switch crude protein contents of your dry feed. So basically, by having a higher protein content in the fresh feed, you can reduce the bought-in protein, and that can equate. So on this real-life farm, switching from they were feeding 246 tons of 21% crude protein feed to their herd, and when they switched to 18% crude protein feed, which they were able to do because of switching to whole crop peas and beans in that silage ration, they were able to reduce their farm carbon footprint by 155 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So it's quite big numbers. This is something that's really important for dairy, is that can reduce the milk, the per kilogram milk footprint, which is really, really challenging to do in the dairy industry at the moment. There's quite a lot of emissions in dairy that are very hard to influence, and so this represents quite a big drop, even though it kind of looks tiny on this graph. So go away, have a play with the carbon calculator. It's free to get started and have a go. If it gets you excited and you start wanting more, there's lots of tools and resources on the website, or you can email us. If there's things that it doesn't yet do, we want to know. That's kind of my job, is to make it better. So please get in touch, and this is the best way to contact us, because it gets through to someone that can find the best person to answer your questions. And yeah, feel free to email us questions. James is my colleague and will be presenting this talk at some of the PGRO sessions, so he's also on the other end of that email, so do get in touch. Okay, thank you.